for the last couple of weeks, and almost nonstop. So people are actually very anxious to get facts. The reason why people are so anxious to get facts is because there's a lot of fear. And the only way to overcome fear is to make sure you have the facts and not some of the chaos that exists out there with non-factual or misinformation. So we're going to dive into all that today. Again, as you said, my name is Mark Warner. I'm the education manager for the ISSA's Cleaning Management Institute. At the end of the program, I'll be able to show you some of my contact information, so that if you decide you want to reach out with any specific questions, we'll certainly welcome it then. Also, I do want to stress that although we're talking about disinfection defense and the things that you've got to do when you're considering reopening your school or your business, it's real important to know that the way I'm going to address all this is going to be more of a generic or generalized scope, since things are very, very different in what you might have to do with a school versus a restaurant versus a retail establishment, or if you're a manufacturer. On the other side of that, I know we have folks that have joined us that are building service contractors, professionals that do cleaning by contract. So they're all rather unique, but they all follow the same kinds of principles. And so we're going to be covering that, and I believe it'll be helpful to all of you. I mean, the big issue is, and I'm sure you've all seen the headlines, our world changed. Our world changed really drastically, more drastically than anything I've experienced in my lifetime. And that's all about, of course, COVID-19. The outbreak has been really the epicenter right now is New York City, but even the West Coast, California, Seattle, Washington, they're not immune. They're experiencing it all throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania as well, upstate New York as well. So everybody's got a little bit of this going on in their lives. I mean, part of the issue, of course, is that these highly infectious and potential lethal diseases have the ability to spread radically. And we've seen that over the years. And we've not only seen it with COVID-19, but we've seen that with MERS and SARS and swine flu and bird flu, and some of us that are involved with healthcare have also seen issues like that with C. diff, and of course, hard to forget what happened in West Africa several years ago with Ebola. So all of those are the things that kind of have changed in the world, and I get asked often, you know, what's the future look like? Well, you know, over the last 30 years, there's been dozens and dozens of new things. Certainly over the last 20 years, I can bring up Ebola and SARS and MERS and now COVID-19. But the bigger question is, you know, what are we looking at down the road? And I guess the big news is that Mother Nature will continue to throw things at us that we're not necessarily prepared for. So that's part of what we have to think about. Are we learning anything from these experiences? And is what we're learning going to be helpful moving forward in the future? And part of it, in order to kind of get rid of some of the misinformation out there, you know, let's cover real quickly what COVID-19 is. I know you've had some previous webcasts from Hill and Marks regarding the history of COVID-19. However, it's important to kind of build that as a foundation of where we're coming from. I mean, COVID-19's got a 3 to 4% mortality rate, according to the most recent studies, and maybe slightly lower than that, actually, because we don't know how many people have truly been identified as being infected. Only those tested are documented as being infected, and a lot of folks haven't been tested yet. So it does show that it's around 3 to 4% now, and it is very, very different from the normal flu. One of the questions that comes up all the time is, don't we get the flu every year? What makes this so different? And there are quite a few things that make it different. One of the things that's kind of worth talking about is, you know, where's this stuff come from? And a lot of these are part of what's called a zoonotic effect. They actually start at the animal kingdom and pass their way through multiple animals, giving them the ability to leap to the human gene pool. And that's where these odd things have come from. The bad news about COVID-19 flu, regular flu, we all worry about that when the flu's going on. The schools that I heard that have tapped in here, you worry about absenteeism with your students. Certainly businesses, manufacturing, and so on all worry about absenteeism, and the regular flu has been an issue for years. The interesting thing to realize, though, the regular flu, if you have the flu, the odds are you're going to pass it to one other person. What makes COVID-19 so radically different is if you have the flu, the odds are that you're going to pass it to 3 other people. And what that means is, instead of being a chain of one person to one other person, it looks like this, which is a geometrical progression, that over time, 1 goes to 3, which goes to 9, which goes to 27, and that is a radical geometrical progression. The bigger issue on that is that the reason why this can actually happen is because you can stay infectious for such a long period of time, and you may be infectious without showing symptoms. So that's the other side of it. The good news, maybe, for somebody to think about is that studies show that 10% of those exposed will become infected. Why is that good news? Because that means 90% of those exposed will not become infected. And a lot of people are under the misinformation that if you're within 6 feet of somebody that's sick, you've got a 100% chance of catching it. That's not true. And that's what creates a lot of fear and paranoia. In other words, if you think about this, if you've got 10 people standing within 6 feet of an infected person, what that means is one of them will get infected and 9 of them won't. So that's something that's kind of worth talking about. People haven't really talked about that because it doesn't play to the fear and paranoia, but it is a fact. Now, when we're talking about flu and we're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about viruses, not bacteria. So that changes the game on some of the things that we know and have studied regarding bacteria-generated diseases. But viruses come in 2 ways. They come as non-enveloped viruses and enveloped viruses. And quite honestly, most people, the common thought is, well, non-enveloped sounds like it'd be easier to kill, and envelope sounds like it'd be pretty tough. Well, the reverse is actually true. A non-enveloped virus is actually something that's quite ancient, and over time it's developed a really rigid, kind of solid mass. Whereas an enveloped virus, on the other hand, is relatively new, like the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, which means that it's got something called a lipid shell. And what all this means, if you think about a non-enveloped virus being a solid mass, picture a marble. How difficult is it to damage a marble? On the other hand, picture an egg. Egg's got a shell on it. How difficult is it to damage that shell? And if you damage the shell, you've damaged the egg inside of it. So the good news is that COVID-19 is an enveloped virus, which means that it has this shell. The shells are relatively easy to destroy. That's the other good news. And it's this shell that becomes ultimately its vulnerability. So that's important for us to know if we're trying to be proactive and to minimize the threat of an infectious disease like this, whether we're trying to prepare a school or a retail establishment for people to come in, or whether we're a building service contractor trying to do this work for somebody. That's really important. Now, I've brought up the issue regarding stores and organizations, and there's been a lot of surveys done. There was actually a survey done in April, a consumer survey, that showed that it's not that consumers are not willing to buy. They do have some concerns, and that is they're very concerned about staying healthy, and they're very, very concerned about what organizations are doing to up their cleanliness measures. And that's part of what comes into play here. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. What we're seeing is a little bit of a consumer pushback on stuff. As you've probably read this about Amazon, there was a little bit of a consumer pushback towards Amazon because people were worried that Amazon wasn't necessarily treating its workers' safety in a fair way. That's been in the news, so it's not just me saying that. Even San Francisco Chronicle has talked about that being an issue that consumers are facing. So these studies have actually had an opportunity to determine what is it that people want to know. And it's really fascinating. And I think this is really an important slide to view. Consumers want to know that all employees are being treated fairly and that they're safe. And that's pretty unique. I mean, when was the last time you remember people really concerned about how somebody else's employee is being treated? That's a rather unique and telltale consumer attitude. The second thing is that employees themselves, they want readily available, readily accessible facial tissues and disinfectant wipes, primarily because somebody might approach them, somebody might sneeze, cough, or whatever, and these give them ways to actually deal with all that. And think about it. We all got away from sneezing into our hands and instead sneezing into our elbow, and now somebody sneezes, 1,500 people in the room spin and stare. Realistically, even that is gone passe. There's really no acceptable reason not to have a disposable facial tissue handy. Employees and consumers themselves, both categories, really want readily accessible hand sanitizer stations and dispensers. So we're getting a lot of questions as to whether there are particular standards about that. Obviously, at any entranceway, every entranceway, there needs to be stations because people want to be able to sanitize their hands on the way in. Doctors' offices, in fact, have people relegated to that task. Their sole job as people enter a doctor's office is to sanitize people's hands on the way in and then to sanitize their hands on the way out. That's its own job, believe it or not. Kind of like a bouncer in a bar, but we're talking about a door person in a healthcare clinic. And that's, I'm seeing, spread beyond just healthcare itself. People are thinking about the rationale of trying to make this a much more comfortable environment for consumers to return to. Consumers want a clean environment. That's the other side of it. They want to know, are the carts clean? Are the checkout areas being cleaned? So they actually want to see employees actively engaged in pulling disinfectant wipes and wiping things down, like the keypad, the credit card reader, and even the conveyor belt on a checkout line at a grocery store. All of these things come into play, as well as, believe it or not, the consumers do want to see one-way traffic patterns going into large businesses so that social distancing can be practiced. They want to see markings on the floor indicating the right way to do it. And it's primarily because consumers want to know that other people are also obeying the same thing that they want to try to obey themselves. The bottom line on this whole thing is everybody wants to see other people practicing something called extreme cleanliness. So everything that we can do that makes us highly visible in the act of cleaning is something that puts consumers at ease. The cleaning industry has always been thought of as one that's seriously committed to making sure things look good. But I got to tell you, there's been a shift in the industry itself. The old philosophy of just cleaning for appearance, cleaning to get the trash out, that's a little bit passe. Realistically, there's a brand new trend in the industry, and that is that cleaning is all about cleaning for health. What's that mean? It means that people want to know that the cleaning is being done in compliance with industry quality standards. I'm always amazed at how few people know that cleaning standards exist internationally. ISSA itself has several cleaning standards. The ISSA K-12 cleaning standards available off that website. The ISSA institutional and commercial cleaning standard for higher ed and manufacturing and BSCs is available there. In fact, bring up BSCs, the SIMS standard, which is the cleaning industry management standard, is available for building service contractors to adhere to when they're trying to meet a standard. The other thing that the industry shifted on is to make sure that people being documented is being certified and trained. There are 260,000 people in the world that have been certified as custodial technicians through the Cleaning Management Institute, which is what I'm involved with the ISSA. 260,000. That sounds like a big number until I tell you that there are over 5 million people in the cleaning industry worldwide. And if you do the math on that, it means 5%. 5% of the industry has been certified as documented, trained, and skilled in the arts and sciences of cleaning, which means that there's an awful lot of room to grow in trying to make sure that people are documented as certified and trained in the arts and sciences of cleaning. Why? Right now, it's about stopping the spread of infectious diseases. Bottom line is, if you don't do it right, you are probably spreading the disease rather than trying to get rid of it. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about best practices. The bottom line is that's one foot, one leg of a stool. That's part of the big value of cleaning. There's an impact on health. There's an impact on other things, including productivity. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But the bottom line is that proper cleaning practices and improved hygiene has been documented, in fact, highly documented, as reducing the spread of infectious diseases. And some of these things are important to know, because what we're talking about is an invisible soil. We're talking about not something you can look over and go, oh, hey, Joan, hey, there's a virus over there on that copier. The reality of it is it's invisible to the naked eye. It makes it an invisible enemy. And the only way to make sure you're going after is to make sure that you're doing best practices, proper procedures, proper products, proper frequencies, and we're going to deal with all that. After all, it's an invisible enemy. And on top of that, it's got a lifespan to it. That's the other scary part. Somebody can sneeze into the air and you can leave the room. You can walk into that room 10 minutes later and still have a potential for being infected because there is opportunity for that to linger in the air. That's a little unnerving. It can live on surfaces like papers or textiles for 3 to 5 hours. It can live on hard surfaces, in some cases, as long as 3 to 5 days. So that changes our whole game too, and it's worth thinking about. What it leads us all to is the acknowledgement that we have to do things right. And if we're not doing it right, there's a really good possibility that all we're doing is spreading it. Even though we're making things look good, we may be spreading it. So let's take a real quick look at what are the best practices for disinfection. It's always amazing to me. I did a program with Fox News several years ago for Houston when they had the floods, and I told them my biggest concern was that people were walking into their offices and their homes with some bathroom cleaner that was rated as a disinfectant and a roll of paper towels and just spraying and wiping things to make it look good. What they didn't realize is they were not, in fact, properly disinfecting, and that was toxic water in those floods, and more than likely they were spreading toxic material. And when I was interviewed, I was asked, well, what is the right procedure? Because, Mark, that's the way I've been doing it. I said, well, that's kind of sad because that's the way most people do it. But the reality of it is you can't disinfect a surface unless it's been pre-cleaned. Think about it for a minute. If there's any kind of dried material on that surface, you spray a disinfectant on it, that dried material is preventing that disinfectant from having the proper amount of exposure time to the surface underneath it. When you go to wipe it up later, in reality, that part of that surface has not had the exposure time required to disinfect. And that does bring up the point that you don't just spray it and wipe it. You really need to make sure that it stays wet for an appropriate amount of time. That's what gives that chemical the ability to break through that lipid shell and deactivate that virus, or to break through the cell wall of bacteria and kill the bacteria. Every disinfectant that you work with is going to have on the label what is the required amount of time that it needs to stay wet for it to be able to disinfect what it's doing. So pre-clean first, to apply a disinfectant heavily so that it's wet, not just spray and wipe it like you're cleaning a piece of glass or a mirror the way you might traditionally do it at home. We need to lay it down and allow it to be wet. Very often, what the best step to do after that is to recover what's wet, dry it all off if you need to put it into service right away. If you don't need to put it into service right away, you can let it dry. In certain very unique instances that are critical, like healthcare or food processing, quick serve restaurants, and so on, where there's food involved, there is a requirement, if a disinfectant is used, to rinse that with, in the United States, it would be tap water. In other countries where tap water is not drinkable, they're required to rinse with water that's appropriate for drinking. So that is the 4 steps of best practice when using a disinfectant. And right now, while we're fighting COVID, it is extremely important that all of us know what these steps are. The question I get on this very often, Katie, is does everybody have to do all these steps? Because I don't see it happening. Well, listen, if you got to boil this down to what you really, really have to do, you have to wipe it down first to make sure it's clean, and then apply the disinfectant and allow it to stay wet. If those steps are skipped, everything else is a moot point. But if you're trying to put, say, a cashier's area back into service after to stay wet, it makes sense to dry it off. And if you are doing food preparation areas, rinsing with water's not only appropriate, but it's the law. So what do you need to wear if you're doing all this stuff? Well, I think it's very important that we want to make sure that if we are an in-house service provider, a K-12 school, higher ed in-house team, we're going to want to make sure that we look like professionals. And professionals do not run around cleaning things without wearing gloves. They just don't. So if we want to look professional, we're wearing gloves. If we're actually doing an environment that's like a bathroom or shower room, or we're doing an area where we're using high-end disinfectants, proper use of a mask and goggles is appropriate. That's the sign of a professional. I travel a lot. When I travel and I see people cleaning, the first thing I look to is whether or not they're doing cleaning without wearing gloves or any kind of safety protection. And if they're not, my first instinct is to believe that I'm seeing an amateur. Sign of a professional is somebody that understands the use of proper PPE. I know that sounds like strong words, but I feel that way very strongly. I've seen people get hurt as a result of not wearing proper PPE, and those were people that I cared about. And so I'm on a campaign to make sure people that are professionals actually present themselves in that manner. The bottom line on this whole issue, and it's a true fact, is that if you're using the world's best disinfectant, some miraculous disinfectant claims that it kills everything, but you don't know what you're doing, you're failing at proper disinfection. And the other side of that's also true. You could be the world's most knowledgeable person about disinfection proper procedures, and if you aren't given the right tools, equipment, and chemistry to do it, you'll also fail. So it's a marriage of both of these things that makes it all work. And if one piece of that is missing, it fails. And the United States government recognized that. In fact, years ago, the EPA wanted to put together a regulation that required it to be law, that if you were using a disinfectant in a public building, you were required to be certified in its proper use. There are countries in Europe that require certification before you're allowed to use a disinfectant in a public building. Why? Because people realize if you don't know how to use it, even if you have the right stuff, odds are you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. So what's happened since this regulation went out there? Well, it got beat. The ISSA basically was on the side of saying, no, we don't need this regulation, this government regulation. And part of the reason was we don't have a workforce large enough that's skilled and documented is trained. So in some form of certification. Will that come again someday? Yes, I suspect it really will. And I suspect most of the 100 or so people on this call will also suspect that something like this will come along someday in the next year, 5 years, 10 years. So it's kind of worth knowing about. Part of what we've gone through in our past is learning what we don't know. And you think about the Ebola outbreak, there was a lot of stuff we learned during the Ebola outbreak, which is actually helping us now. They actually did some documents that said that there's proper things that we need to deal with, and we weren't prepared back then. We need to make sure that we've got some way of detecting the problem. You're seeing that on the news. If you're watching the news at all, it's about all they talk about is testing and detection. And then the big question is, and the reason why we're on this call is, how do we protect ourselves? What is the proper disinfection defense we need to engage with? And then there's the other issue, and that is, we've got some documentation of somebody having COVID-19. They were in here an hour ago, a day ago. How do we go about decontamination? And that's response to an active event. So all of this, we have the opportunity to kind of work with. The military has had some opportunity to try to develop a risk assessment. Many of you, if you're involved with K-12 school or higher ed, you know all about risk assessments. If you're a building service contractor, you know part of what you have to mandate for how you're going to do things is based on what level of risk that you're facing. And all of those things have an influence on what tools you take with you, what PPEs and so on. So the way this all breaks down, and this is embraced by the United States military, is that there's three primary levels we need to look at. One is that there is no infectious disease threat out there, so our standard operating procedures, which is based on how we go about cleaning, what our frequencies are, what we focus on, all standard. It stays the same if there's no infectious disease threat. The big question is what do we change if there is a threat? What happens if there is a documentation of an infectious disease in our community? And that's called a sanitary defense condition level 2. For most of us on this call, that's right where we are right now. Sanitary defense condition level 3 is where you're going in to decontaminate an area where there's been a presence, an active presence of, in this case, COVID-19. So before I jump into level 2, I think it's really relevant to say that at level 1 is what we were all trained at. I was trained on level 1. You were all trained on level 1. Standard operating procedures. Hey, Mark, go dust mop, go mop that floor once a day. Make sure you're doing the doorknobs and the handrails in the bathroom and so on daily. That's the SOP, standard operating procedure for a non-threat environment. The only thing I want to really say about that during this webcast, because I'm very, very much into making sure people involved in the cleaning industry are not exposed to toxic materials. Years ago, when I started in this field, there were a lot of toxic materials that we brought into a building in an effort to do it. So let's talk about sanitary defense condition level 2. What is it that we change about that versus the way we're trained? What changes in our SOP, our standard operating procedures? Well, number 1 is we want to change our products. We want to make sure that the products that we're working with are effective against the threat that we're facing. In this particular instance, we're facing COVID-19. So if we're using products that make no claim to be effective for human coronavirus, emerging pathogens, COVID-19, then all we're doing is exercising, essentially wasting our time. The bottom line is products have to show that they're effective on these to actually be appropriate for use. Procedurally, that means we need to focus on the hot spots in a room. We all know touch points are a hot spot, but they're only one of 3 hot spots. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then frequencies need to change. This is what people want to hear, what they want to see. When they come to you and say, hey, what are you guys doing differently? The answer that they don't want to hear is hummina, 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 we're working harder, boss. What they do want to hear is, I'm glad you've asked that question. We have embraced this into a sanitary defense level 2, which means that we've changed the products that we're working with to make sure they're effective on going after COVID-19. We've changed our procedures to make sure we're focusing on the 3 primary hotspots in a room or building. And we've upped our frequencies to make sure that we're dealing with it appropriately. That's proper due diligence. And that's what we're doing now that the environment has changed to this COVID thing. We will continue to do that until the threat is past. And once the threat is past, we'll go back to doing what we were before, which is making it look and smell nice for you. Excuse me. So the bottom line is that we know that surfaces cause transfers. And our hands touch surfaces. And it's pretty obvious that one of the surfaces might be doorknobs, might be handrails, might be light fixtures, and so on. The issue is not that this stuff makes us sick by going through our hand. The issue is that our hands come in contact with a portal of entry, literally a hole in our body that allows things to enter, like eyes, nose, mouth, or even a wound. So when it gets onto our hands, it now has the opportunity to enter what's called a portal of entry. And that's what we need to be concerned about. Now, it'd be no problem if none of us ever touched our face. But the reality of it is, everybody on this call is going to touch their face at least 20 times an hour. Look around the room. Anybody sitting there with their hand on their chin, rubbing their nose, rubbing their eye? It's an unconscious event. It's not something you think about. People touch their face without thinking about it 20 times an hour, which is why technically these things, our hands, have to be kept impeccably clean as often as possible, because we're not going to know how often we're touching our face. 20 times an hour. Look around the room. So we know that these surfaces act as reservoirs. So the big question I want to throw out at you is, what are they? You know, touch points. I mentioned that that is your top three. Doorknobs, handrails, keypads, all of those things that we touch frequently and often, those are all very, very important to touch on. But would you be surprised to hear that in studies that we've done to identify what has the most bacteria or viruses, that out of the top three, touch points don't rank as number one? So you might be wondering, wow, that's an interesting bit of news. Well, here's some facts for you. That anything expelled into the air, whether it's viruses or bacteria, will eventually precipitate out of the air and end up on horizontal surfaces. And those horizontal surfaces that I'm talking about is desktops, countertops, reception desks. All of these horizontal surfaces become an area that collects all this stuff from the air. And believe it or not, the tests and the findings on these above the floor horizontal surfaces very often are higher than touch points, because the act of touching tends to do depositing as well as removing, whereas these are just collecting. Now, some of you in the room are saying, wow, if he's talking about horizontal surfaces, what's the biggest horizontal surface in a room? Yeah, bang, floors. In fact, floors are the superhighways of all pathogenic microorganisms. What that means is they collect more than anything else. It's been documented. It's been shown. That is the largest reservoir of pathogens. So some of you may be saying, well, I don't touch the floor. Well, my answer to that is, ha, 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 yes, you do. But you don't think about it. The soles of your shoes traffic things from room to room. The wheels of your carts traffic things from room to room. The wheels on your cleaning equipment traffic things from room to room. That's the superhighway of how it gets around. But once it gets into that room, your room, now it's looking for some other vehicle to use to get to where your hand will touch it. That's called an incidental contact. An incidental contact is me dropping my pen on the floor and picking up that pen with my hand. It's me dropping my reading glasses out of my pocket and picking them up and putting them on my face. It's about me putting my laptop bag or my carry bag down on the floor, picking it up and putting it on my desk so I can take something out of it and then putting it back down. Now my hand can touch that desk. Or a woman who might have a purse that's on the floor, picking it up, putting it on her desk or counter to take something out of it. Anything that was on that floor has the opportunity to transfer immediately to the bottom of that case, and that transfer to that case that happens immediately to the surface top. Here's a good thought for you. How long does it take for it to transfer? Is there such a thing as a 5-second rule? No. Think about this. Those of you that are parents, if I take a dirty diaper and a clean diaper, how quickly do I have to tap them so nothing transfers? Exactly. So there's an immediate transfer. This whole event is called a fomite event. And that is for things to use other vehicles to get to where your hands will come in contact with it. And there's another bit of fact for you to think about. All of you as adult human beings are going to interact with the floor 50 times a day and never even think about it. Anybody in the room ever going to pick up a cord? What was the cord laying on? It's laying on the floor. Anybody going to tie their shoelace when it comes untied? That's been dragging across the floor. Well, hopefully it wasn't dragging through a public restroom. Think about that for a minute. Bottom line is that these are our three primary reservoirs we got to think about. So we tell somebody that we're dealing with our procedures, we're focusing on the three primary reservoirs. its floors, its desktop countertops, and its touch points. And can we afford to ignore any of those? Well, no, we really can't. When we look at products, we want to make sure the products that we're working with have the ability to kill what we're worried about killing, that they also have some cleanliness impact on the ability to clean. We call that cleaning efficacy versus killing efficacy. If we're going to practice extreme cleanliness, the ideal disinfectant will help us in both categories. When we're talking about disinfectants themselves, you already heard me say that the label is your telltale. What is it that I use, where, when, and how? I'm telling you straight out, in the United States, the EPA monitors disinfectant label claims very closely. It's straight out illegal for you to offer a product and make a claim of it disinfecting unless the EPA has approved it. The approvals, of course, that they're looking for, that you're looking for, does it say SARS-CoV-2? It may or may not. Let's face it, this is a brand new novel coronavirus. There's disinfectants that have been on the market for months, days, years before this even existed. So that may not be on the label. If it is, it's a brand new product, brand new to the supply chain. But if it's an older product, it still can be effective. What you're going to want to find is the human coronavirus kill claim on it, and you're going to want to find a statement that the EPA has approved this for emerging pathogens. It's called the emerging pathogen provision. The way that works is the idea that if something brand new comes along, if the EPA has that provision on the label, it'll be right there on the label, it means that they know that this particular disinfectant's been effective on things similar, things that were threatening in the past, and so it is assumed that it will go after this. If it doesn't have either the SARS-CoV-2 claim or the human coronavirus kill claim and the emerging pathogen provision, then I dare say it's not approved by the EPA to be used to go after and make a claim that you're disinfecting for COVID-19. And question that, just ask the EPA. I get asked all the time, what disinfectants are effective? Well, listen, there's a lot of different chemistries out there. They all have versions that are effective. We all know that bleach can be effective, but not a cup of bleach in your laundry. That's somewhere around 1 to 100. Bleach to be effective as a disinfectant's got to be mixed at 1 to 10. Anybody that's ever worked with bleach at 1 to 10 knows that's strong. It'll burn your eyes and give you a sore throat. Hydrogen peroxide is another form of bleach, a non-chlorinated bleach, and highly effective. It's been gone through a lot of development over recent years so that it was stabilized, so that it would be effective. So we're seeing a lot of hydrogen peroxides in use in healthcare. Quaternary ammoniums, or nicknamed quats, been around a long time. There are quats that do make a kill claim that's effective, and there's other quats that are used in 1 to 512 air dry sanitizers that would not make the appropriate claim. Chlorine dioxide is one of the components used in electrostatic spraying, so that's effective if used at their proper dilution. Hypochlorous acid is part of the electrolyzed water concept, where if you electrocute water, you create two streams. One stream is cleaner, the other stream is hypochlorous acid, HOCl, which has the ability, when used in high concentration and right away, to go after COVID-19. And there's others that are highly corrosive used in healthcare, glutaraldehyde and so on. Bottom line is, read the label. And if in doubt, contact the manufacturers. They'll be happy to talk to you about it. But as we dive into this a little bit deeper, one of the things that comes up all the time is, we're sanitizing. Is that good enough? Well, there's a difference in terms. We, as professionals in the commercial cleaning space, know that there is a legal definition for cleaning, for sanitizing, and for disinfecting, and they are all different. The bottom line is that cleaning, which although it makes things look good, it does have some effect on reducing the threat. That effect is that it will remove up to 90% of the pathogenic microorganisms on those surfaces. That's great. But 90% is not 100%. It's not even close to 99%. So cleaning alone leaves behind a considerable amount of this invisible enemy. So then we start to look at sanitizing, and sanitizing's been in play for many, many years. Sanitizing is something that's monitored by the health department in food service operations. Sanitizing is to make sure that any disease-causing microorganisms are killed to a level of 99.999. That's called a 5-log reduction. That's the definition of sanitizing. So if you're somewhere between 90 and 99.999, you're in that sanitizing realm. And the negative there is that technically at a 5-log reduction, 99.999, there's still trace amounts of bacteria being left behind. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Disinfection is called a 6-log reduction. It's 99.9999. So you may wonder, well, that's kind of like splitting hairs there, isn't it, Mark? And the reality of it is, no, that's really a radically big difference. 99.9999 for disinfectants means that every single sample that was tested and submitted to the EPA showed absolutely no bacteria or viruses surviving. That's as good as you can get on random sampling, short of 100%. 100% means you have to test every time it's used everywhere all the time. So 99.999 log, 6-log reduction basically means that in no case has there ever been an instance where any bacteria or viruses survived it. Whereas in sanitizing, there is documentation that some bacteria or viruses were left behind, but in low enough concentrations that the Department of Health did not consider it to be a health threat. But let's think about that for a minute real quick. If I'm leaving behind, if I'm only doing 99.999, a million of them fit on the, well, let's say a 1/4 inch area like that. A million fit on that pretty easy. If I'm doing 99.999, I'm leaving 10 on the end of that pen. That doesn't sound like much, but that's 40 per square inch. That's 5,000 per square foot, which is over 50,000 on 10 square feet, which is an area that might be large enough to prepare your lunch on. So one of the things we want to think about is if we've got the ability to disinfect a hard surface, we certainly should. Other things cannot make a disinfected claim. Do you disinfect your hands? No, you use a hand sanitizer because sanitizing your hands is as good as it gets. It's porous. Your skin is porous. My clothing is textile. It's porous. Carpeting is textile. It's porous. You really can't make a disinfection claim on those. The best you can do is to make a sanitizing claim. So that's where sanitizing makes a very appropriate claim. Diving into this a little bit further, one of the questions that comes up all the time is, hey, well, if I'm worried about it, I'll just make it a little stronger. Oh, no. Bad. Obviously, we all know that if you make it too weak, you're probably not killing what you want. But by over-diluting it, by putting it in too rich, by putting in too much product, making it too rich, you cause other problems. Some of those are that solution now will not dry away the right way, and more than likely you're going to leave behind a sticky, tacky residue, which will attract and hold debris, which acts as another reservoir for bacteria and viruses. Think about a sticky surface like adhesive tape collects and holds things. So the studies show that it holds and attracts soil at a 10 times higher rate than a clean surface. So with that said, making it too rich is a no-no, and there's another reason why. If you look on the label, hell, the label says it's against the law to use a product inconsistent with the way it's labeled. And if it says mix it at 2 ounces per gallon, mix it at 1 ounces per gallon, if it says that and you mix it in any other way, you're breaking the law, number one. There's a really big question of whether or not there's any liability to be shared as a result of using a product inconsistent with the labeling. The FIFRA police, that's FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, is all about monitoring whether or not people are doing things right. So part of what we talked about there is getting a good understanding of this whole risk assessment. It gives me the opportunity to, again, dive into what happens real quickly if something happens in the facility. Well, that's where we change our procedures a little bit more. We change our frequencies a little bit more, obviously making sure we're dealing with the right products. So then we start looking at things beyond the surfaces that we're cleaning. We start to look at things like the substrates. What's happening in the nap of the carpet down near the backing? What's happening in the grout of the floor? These are things that have the ability to absorb liquids down into them. And how do we go after that? I mean, the proper way to do that is not with disinfectants, but with bacteriologicals and bio-enzymatics that displace them down in those subsurface areas. See, disinfectants are rated to be a surface cleaning agent only. Think about it. You got toxic mold inside your wall board. How effective it is if you walk up to the wall and spray it with bleach and wipe it with a paper towel. Are you doing anything to the mold inside the wall? Not at all. So same thing can happen when you think about materials that might have soaked down into a carpet or down into floor grouting. It's no longer a surface element, and we need different chemistry to do it. And then there's airborne. Can you really just walk into a room and give it 2 shots out of an aerosol can and claim that you've sanitized all the air in it? Really? Does anybody really believe that? Obviously, if you can see droplets coming out of the spray, that's heavier than air, and it's dropping out of the air and precipitating, and you can't see the bacteria in the air, so they're very, very different. Is there really any contact time happening? Anyway, I'm not sure anybody actually buys into all that, but it is something we see on the consumer side a lot. The things that we tend to see as true professional ways to decontaminate is electrostatic sprayers, misters, foggers, using, in some cases, very radical technology. Chlorine dioxides, ethylene oxides, some of those are actually really rather poisonous. Point is, if you're doing fumigating, it's really something that can only be done in an unoccupied building. On the other hand, some new technology is out there. There's folks on this call, I noticed, that are very familiar with the technology of electrolyzed water, and the ability to electrolyze water creates the opportunity to generate a stream, a split stream, but one stream of hypochlorous acid. That's something that's been approved for use in fogging applications without being toxic. Kind of interesting. The other thing that we tend to see a lot is the use of UVC lighting, UVA and UVC. And these are units that we see generally up on walls in healthcare and OR rooms, exam rooms. They kind of work like an aquarium filter. They go after airborne bacteria and viruses and deactivate it. So that's some of the technology that we're seeing out there. Some of you that are involved with K through 12 schools and higher ed, you may have some UVC lighting systems inside your HVAC system. Other of you, those on the call might be building service contractors. You may have a box on wheels like that one on the right, which is a portable unit used to sanitize. Healthcare, of course, is using robots. These things go. And that's being used in healthcare to make sure that UV is used as a insurance policy after the wipe down to make sure there's no bacteria or viruses left behind. And we're seeing some new technology that's kind of incorporating UV lighting into fluorescent lights, which is kind of interesting. But I wanted to cover that part of you regarding the whole decontamination. The big question that's coming up a lot is, I get the need to change the products. I get the need to focus on the hot spots. I get the need to increase frequencies. Well, how are we going to increase frequencies, especially if we've got limited staff? I mean, higher frequencies definitely allows for a deeper cleaning. It's taken us away from what used to be acceptable with spot cleaning and making sure that if we're cleaning it, we're cleaning everything we said we're cleaning. But that labor has a factor there. So how do you look at that? So people are looking at robotics, man. That's the way to do it. Unmanned assistance in creating increased frequencies. So automation becomes one of the potential solutions to meeting the demand and increased labor without increasing our human labor pool. So what we're seeing is a lot of news about this. And if you've been watching the news at all, you've probably seen a lot of references to robotics and how they are helping to fill the gap, let's say. And part of the new technology is not just robotics, but it's actually getting into something called cobotics, which is robots working in conjunction with human beings. Kind of cool. Some of the robotics that we see out there are represented in all these random pictures, but where they all come together is they have to meet certain standards. They need to have training that's related to their proper use, and that's what allows technology to be embraced. And part of that technology is the ability to communicate. The whole idea of communication enhancement. We have a need to know where things are being done, when they were being done. Do we have a way to verify it? Do we have a way of documenting it? And a lot of us on this call know that there's a lot of equipment out there that's now sharing its status with somebody in charge of facilities. Things like as simple as maybe a toilet or towel cabinet that might share its quantity or need for refill, to automatic floor scrubbers that are letting people know where their location is and what their actual runtime has been. That's the way we verify and validate that these things have happened. And through this Internet of Things, it's providing things like what's the frequency, what's the effectiveness. All of that, it has to be made readily available to people so that they can look at that data. So to sum this all up, what are the 5 needs for success? You have to have the right chemistry. We got to have the right training and certification. We've got to adjust our frequencies. We've got to know what our threat level is, know how to do a risk assessment, and some way to verify and validate that we are successful. Hey, this is an invisible enemy. What the heck are we going to do to prove we did what we said we were going to do? Some of you have been involved with healthcare, and you know that in the past we used black lights, invisible ink stamp on the surface, and then a supervisor, an inspector would come through, and if they saw that invisible ink stamp, they'd know that surface was not wiped down. That is a way of validating whether or not a process or procedure had taken place. Pretty simplistic, costs less than $10, but still effective in verifying or validating that a cleaning process took place. Indoor air quality meters is another thing that we do, oftentimes used to measure the cleanliness of carpet, believe it or not. And then there's ATP meters. These are referenced quite often in the ISSA standards. These ATP meters are able to detect the presence of organic microorganisms, which is again a way of validating whether or not a cleaning process took place. So all of those things are ways of verifying and validating that we did what we said we were going to do. Bottom line is professionals can help, but I definitely want to stress the fact it wrong, re-glove, and go back and do it right. Training is the key, and only continuous training provides continuous improvement. Bottom line is of this whole program is it's about human health and safety, and is there anything more important than that? Katie, I tried to cover everything you and I discussed and give everybody a platform that they could move forward with in reopening their business. Personally, I tried very hard to customize this to fit what everybody's needs might be, and I'm certainly very hopeful that many of you found this helpful. Thanks for listening. Katie?
Yes, Mark, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for all of your insight and knowledge. And with that being said, you all, if you have any questions, please submit any of the questions you have in chat, or feel free to unmute yourselves and ask some questions for Mark. And we have some Helen Mark's team members on here as well that'd be happy to answer some questions. So we'll leave this the next 5 minutes for some Q&A.
Any questions come in through the chat window, Katie?
Not yet.
I can think of some good ones.
Okay.
But we can give everybody an opportunity to think about it. Some of the questions that I get have to do with supply chain fulfillment. And I thought that was something that you and the management team at Hill and Marks might want to touch on, because one of the big concerns nowadays is, I get what Mark's saying about needing the right stuff, but is it all readily available now? Because we're seeing in the news some disruption in supply chains. So I thought that might be a opportunity for Hill and Mark's management team to assist in the program and help the customers.
Absolutely. We did get a question from a customer, so I do want to get to that first, but they said disinfectant claims that state for feline versus human, are those acceptable to be appropriate disinfectant solution?
They're making a claim of feline versus human? Is that the question?
Yeah, disinfectant claims that state for feline versus human, are those acceptable to be an appropriate disinfectant solution?
If it doesn't say human coronavirus, then I suspect it won't make an emerging pathogen claim. If it doesn't make the emerging pathogen claim, there's no way to assume that it does COVID-19. So my answer to that question is, if it says feline coronavirus and it also says the emerging pathogen provision, I would go with it. If it doesn't have the emerging pathogen provision on it, then I would have to say that I couldn't, in good faith, say that it did COVID-19.
We also got another question that said, are the PowerPoint charts available for printing?
Are the PowerPoint charts slides
available for printing? So I'm thinking you mean the PowerPoint, and we will be having this PowerPoint on the Hill and Marks website for you to be able to download, as well as we recorded this webinar, and so you'll be able to watch it at your leisure as well. So we will be sending that out to everyone who attended this webinar today, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, so remember, if you're using it, the proper ethics is to show credit where credit's due. It came from Hill and Marks.
Hill and Marks and ISSA. We got another one. I won't use air hand dryers in bathrooms because of your point about floors. Thought about air hand dryers.
What was the question?
He after learning about your point about bathrooms and floors and bacteria going onto those surfaces, he isn't interested in using hand dryers. So do you have any opinion about air dryers? I know Hill and Marks definitely recommends paper towel dispensers, and we feel that that's the way to go as far as bathroom sanitation, and we also recommend touch-free to avoid any type of bacteria transfer. But Mark, do you have any specific opinion about that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of concern about whether or not air dryers have the ability to take airborne dust, allergens, viruses, and cause it to go airborne. And if it goes airborne, it gets into the breathing space, and that's a problem. So personally, I like using hand towels, but when I travel, I don't often have that option. So if I'm using an air dryer, knowing that there's a possibility of a burst of air that might contain some form of other contaminant, I will follow up with hand sanitizer.
And Brian, for asking that question, I would recommend getting in touch with a Hill and Mark representative, and we can get you all situated with a paper towel dispenser. Also, we have so much, just a shameless plug there.
Well done. Well done.
We also have someone that said, thank you so much for the very relevant and superb information. So Mark, thank you with that. Someone else wanted to say, why bother with sanitizing?
You can only sanitize non-porous or porous surface. So you can't disinfect a porous surface. You can't disinfect your hands, so you have to sanitize it. You can't disinfect your carpeting, so you have to sanitize it. But to the point that's being made there, if you can in fact disinfect a hard surface, why wouldn't you? So I get the point. It's a good point.
Another question was, what procedure should be used to disinfect floors, considering it's a constant struggle?
Just keep in mind, the reason why I said there's 3 levels of efficacy, and one of them is cleaning, one of them is sanitizing, and one of them is disinfection, is that what we need to be practicing right now is extreme cleanliness. So even if you're just using a neutral floor cleaner to clean your floors, but you're doing that very, very often, you are still removing this reservoir of pathogens. You're removing 90% of what's down there, which is 10 times healthier than it was 3 months ago. So You're not always going to be in a position where you're disinfecting floors repeatedly throughout a day. A hospital or healthcare environment might be doing that, but you may be working with auto scrubbers and neutral floor cleaners. I'm fine with that. Just for the record, I'm fine with that. If what we're doing is increasing our frequencies and we're doing it often enough so that we're removing soil, I'm totally fine with that. And I get that question a lot. It's a great question. So I hope that's help in the answer.
We also have a question. If bleach is the best option available to disinfect from a supply chain availability perspective, what is your advice on using that type of product versus other more advanced chemical technologies?
I would not say bleach is the best. I would say that it's an old and ancient approach to going after disinfection, but bleach has got some negative effects. I mean, you're not going to use bleach on my shirt, unless it were white. You're not going to use bleach on carpeting. So there are surfaces that the corrosive nature of bleach is not good for. I listed earlier all kinds of disinfectant properties that are effective. They all have pros and cons. The benefit of bleach is that it's highly corrosive. So we know that it attacks and kills things that way. A lot of the other chemistry that I mentioned works on other principles of what's called deactivation of viruses and bacteria, and it can do that without being corrosive. So all the technologies have versions which I would claim to be very, very effective, and I really am not here to say any one is best.
Okay. We have quite a few questions coming in. So someone also asked, is it true that bleach products should not be used on food prep services? If this is true, what products are best for this?
Actually, bleach products used on food prep surfaces is very common. So part of the whole safe serve thing is bleach. Most chefs, love the smell of a bleached kitchen when they enter. But anytime bleach is used at a concentration higher than 1 to 100, which is a sanitizing ratio, if it's used very strong at a richer mix than 1 to 100, like I talked about 1 to 10 to be a disinfectant, the FDA, Safe Serve, and so on requires that it gets rinsed. Once it's rinsed with effectively drinking water, that surface is ready to prepare food on. So I hope that's helpful.
I was thinking we could get to some other questions that were presented to us. So what are your thoughts on alcohol-based hand sanitizers versus non-alcohol-based hand sanitizers in K through 12 schools?
So both have levels of effectiveness. In prison environments, correctional facilities, youth detention centers, lower level grades in K through 12, there's a fear about consumption of alcohol, in which case it seems safer and more prudent to work with a non-alcohol. But if you're working with non-alcohol, it's probably a BZT ingredient, and you're going to want to make sure that that product is showing the right kill claim for sanitizing. Does it list human coronavirus? Does it have the emerging pathogen? There are some out there that do and some that don't. Quite honestly, if you're watching CDC and all that stuff, they tend to default to high concentration of almost 70% isopropyl alcohol for hand sanitizing, but there are some non-alcohols that make the claim. You just have to look at your label, and if in doubt, call the manufacturer. They can't lie to you. They have to tell you the truth by law.
Okay, and then is there a disinfectant that can be placed on a surface and last longer than the next touch, like a Microban 24?
So there's been a lot of claims like that out there. My biggest concern is that people think that if you reintroduce something into the area, that surface for some reason is going to kill what you've introduced. And that's not really what that's about. Those things are designed to inhibit the growth of bacteria, number one. Viruses aren't bacteria. They don't grow. They don't reproduce. Secondly, if I sneeze on that floor and large droplets come out of my mouth, the floor, no matter what I treated it with, is not going to reach up through those droplets and disinfect it. What the floor will do, if it's been treated, is inhibit the growth of anything. But I'm very skeptical about claims that would not require fresh cleaning and disinfection when a contaminant, in other words, a human being, re-entered the environment. So if it's an environment I'm bringing my kids into, I don't want somebody to tell me that they treated it 2 weeks ago, so don't worry about it. If I'm taking my kids into that environment, fair enough?
Fair enough. Okay, we have about 2 more questions and we'll kind of wrap this up. So one question is, what is the most effective way to extreme clean carpeting?
Carpet cleaning falls into 3 categories: daily routine, interim, and restorative. Daily routine is vacuuming. There's nothing happening there that's necessarily going to be disinfecting. Interim forms of carpet maintenance include the use of encapsulation chemistry and things like that. Some of those can carry a sanitizing claim. Some don't. Most don't, but some do. And then the deepest level of cleaning on carpeting is to run an extractor over it, pressurized system, which would flood and extract the water back out of it. And there's sanitizing solutions that are made for those. If you don't have a sanitizing solution for use in your extractor or in your low moisture interim form of carpet cleaning, just the act of a higher level of frequency of cleaning is really what I'm hoping to see people do. Most people vacuum their carpet for months on end before they ever introduce it to any form of cleaning. So if we're trying to figure out what can we do, listen, even if you're just cleaning the carpet, but you're doing it very, very often, you are certainly 100 times better off than you were 3 months ago when we were all waiting around to clean carpet for the next time the truck mount guy was coming in November to extract it. Making a joke, but you know what I mean.
We also have, this will be the last question, and I did want to say that someone said, thank you so much for the presentation. They found it very helpful. So just for clarity on cleaning your hands, I thought the lipid fatty bilayer could be broken down by hand soap. What is the need to sanitize after?
I don't have an answer for that. In fact, hand soap is made in such a variety of ways, from antibacterials to those that are completely pH neutral. Some have some solvency to it. Work soaps are very aggressive. Really, there's such a variance in those. I don't have a way of making a comment on that other than if it doesn't say on the label it kills COVID-19, hand soap or otherwise, you cannot say you dealt with it. By law, you can't say you did.
Okay. All right. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Mark. You did a fabulous job and was very insightful and informative, and we are very grateful to you for speaking to our customer base today on this. I did want to let everyone know that we are doing these webinars weekly, and you can visit helenmarks.com to sign up for our next webinars or contact your sales representative to learn about any product information and more. I did want to tease that we are starting a consulting program powered by ISSA, Helen Marks Institute, and I did want to tease that for you. There will be some trainings and certifications with that, and so keep your eyes and ears open for that information and when that goes live, because we want to help all of you and keep your facility safe and healthy. So on behalf of Helen Marks, we want to thank you very much for today, and a big thank you to Mark. We have recorded this webinar and we'll be sure to share it with you all. Thank you so much.